Watch a man stand up in front of 300 people and call his wife broken. He didn't know the doctor's report sitting in her purse said otherwise. He didn't know it would name his own family's fortune after a child he swore didn't exist. The ballroom of the Callaway Grand Meridian had gone silent in that particular way only money can afford, no gasps, no whispers, just 300 perfectly composed people pretending not to stare while a woman in a pale blue dress absorbed the worst sentence of her marriage in front of all of them. Julian Callaway stood at the microphone with a champagne flute in one hand and his mother's smile stitched onto his face, and he said the words like he was announcing a merger. My wife cannot give this family an heir. It is time we stopped pretending otherwise. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman in emerald silk lowered her eyes and pressed a hand to her stomach, and the room did the math on its own. Naomi Callaway did not cry. She did not drop her glass. She stood very still in a room built by her husband's grandfather, wearing a thin gold bracelet that had belonged to a woman none of them had ever met, and she let them believe whatever they needed to believe. What none of them knew, what even Naomi herself would not know for 11 more days, was that inside her body, at that exact moment, the only legitimate Callaway heir in a generation had already begun to exist. This is the story of how a woman they tried to erase from a $100 billion legacy turned out to be the one thing holding it up. To understand how Naomi Callaway ended up standing alone in that ballroom, you have to go back 9 years, to a town most of the people in that room couldn't find on a map. Millhaven, Ohio wasn't the kind of place that produced women who married into families like the Callaways. It produced women who worked at the diner on Route 9, who patched their own roofs, who learned early that nobody was coming to rescue them. Naomi Reyes was raised by her grandmother, a widow named Odalise who ran a small tailoring shop out of the front room of her house and never once, in 18 years, let Naomi see her cry, no matter how tight money got or how many nights she sat up doing hems by lamplight to make rent. Odalise had a way of talking that stuck to a person for life. She used to say the world will hand you 100 reasons to explain yourself, and you don't owe it a single one. Naomi grew up believing that quiet wasn't the same as weak. She believed you could carry an entire storm inside your chest and still pour someone's coffee with a steady hand. There was a particular afternoon, when Naomi was 16 and furious about a boy who'd humiliated her in front of the whole school cafeteria, that Odalise sat her down at the sewing table and threaded a needle without looking up. You want to scream at him, I know, her grandmother said. Do it once, in this room, where nobody but me will remember it. Then go back out there tomorrow and let him wonder why you're not broken. Naomi never forgot the lesson underneath it, that the people who hurt you rarely deserve the full weight of your reaction, and the ones who do deserve it are usually smart enough to never let you see it land. It was a belief that would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She met Julian Callaway the summer she turned 24, waiting tables at a lakeside inn where his family's company was scouting a boutique hotel site. He was 28 then, still soft around the edges in a way the money hadn't hardened out of him yet, and he liked her immediately for reasons that had nothing to do with what she could offer his family's empire. She made him laugh. She told him the truth even when it wasn't flattering. On their third date he confessed, half joking, that every woman he'd ever brought home had been auditioned by his mother before he was allowed to fall for her, and Naomi had laughed and said she wasn't planning on auditioning for anybody. He married her 11 months later anyway, in a small ceremony his mother barely attended, and for a while, it was enough that he'd chosen her over the family's expectations. There was one person in that family who never once made her feel like an intruder, and it was the last person anyone would have predicted. Elias Callaway, the patriarch, the man who had built the hotel empire from a single roadside motel his own father left him, took a liking to Naomi almost the moment he met her. He saw something in her his son and daughter-in-law never bothered to look for. One evening, early in the marriage, he found her sitting alone on the terrace of the family's lake house while the rest of them argued inside about quarterly numbers, and he sat down beside her without a word for a long time. Then he said something she would carry for the rest of her life. This family mistakes silence for nothing to say. That's their mistake to make, not yours. He told her that a family built on money forgets, generation by generation, what actually built it, and that the people who remember are usually the ones nobody bothered to flatter. He asked her, almost offhandedly, whether her grandmother was still alive, and when Naomi said yes, he nodded slowly, like that answered a question he hadn't fully asked yet. Women like that don't raise women who fall apart easy, he said. I've watched this family chew through people for 60 years. It's never once managed to chew through anyone who was raised the way I suspect you were. She thought at the time he was simply being kind to a nervous new daughter-in-law. She would understand years later that Elias Calloway had been quietly building her a lifeboat the entire time, long before she knew she'd need one. The years that followed were not the fairy tale the wedding photos suggested. Julian's mother, Vivian, never warmed to her, not once, not for one holiday, one anniversary, one ordinary Sunday dinner in 9 years. To Vivian, Naomi would always be the waitress, a stain on a bloodline that had spent 3 generations marrying into old money and older names. And when year after year passed without a pregnancy, Vivian found in it the perfect weapon, one she didn't even have to forge herself. Naomi and Julian had tried for 6 years. There had been 2 losses early on, quiet griefs that Naomi carried mostly alone because Julian, uncomfortable with anything that couldn't be fixed with money, retreated into work each time it happened. Doctors ran test after test and found nothing definitively wrong with either of them, which was its own kind of torment, an ambiguous verdict that let Vivian fill in the blank however she chose. She chose infertile, and she said it at dinner tables, at charity galas, into the ears of board members' wives, until the word calcified into a fact nobody bothered to check. There was a Thanksgiving, for years into the marriage, that Naomi would replay in her mind more than any other. She had just come from a follow-up appointment that morning, another test, another shrug from a specialist who couldn't explain what wasn't showing up, and she'd arrived at the Calloway estate late, still raw, hoping for 1 hour where nobody would ask her anything. Vivian offered a small toast before the meal, thanking the family for its many blessings, its health, its future, its children, pausing just long enough on the word children for every adult at the table to understand exactly who it wasn't meant to include. Julian said nothing. He looked down at his plate and let it happen, the way he let most things happen that required him to choose a side, and Naomi smiled and passed the cranberry sauce and drove home in silence with her hands so tight on the wheel her knuckles ached the next morning. What none of them knew, what Naomi herself had begun to doubt after so many disappointments, was that her body had never been the obstacle everyone assumed it was. She had a condition, undiagnosed for years, that made early pregnancy symptoms nearly invisible and made carrying to a detectable stage unusually difficult without exact timing and specific care, something her own doctor back in Millhaven had once mentioned in passing, and that the expensive specialists in the city, treating her more like an heiress-shaped problem to be solved than a patient to be understood, had somehow never properly investigated. It is a particular kind of cruelty, being failed by expertise you're paying a fortune for. Naomi didn't know any of this yet. All she knew was that she was 33 years old, that 6 years of trying had produced 6 years of grief, and that her husband had started coming home later, and colder, and smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. Her name was Celine Marchetti, and she arrived in Julian's life the way trouble often does, disguised as an answer to a problem he hadn't admitted he had. She was a hospitality consultant Vivian herself had brought in to help modernize the Calloway boutique properties, sharp and beautiful and endlessly patient with Julian in a way his exhausted, grieving wife no longer had the energy to be. Vivian saw exactly what was happening and did nothing to stop it, because for the first time in 9 years, she saw a path to the ending she'd wanted all along. What Naomi didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Julian's interest in Celine wasn't only romantic. It was financial rescue dressed up as romance. Julian had spent 3 years quietly siphoning funds from a family trust to cover disastrous personal investments, bets made trying to prove to his father that he could build something of his own instead of simply inheriting one. Elias had passed away 18 months earlier, and with him gone, the walls Julian had been hiding behind were starting to crumble. Auditors were asking questions. The board was asking questions. And Julian, cornered and desperate, had convinced himself that a clean divorce, a fresh marriage, and a fast pregnancy with a woman positioned to please his mother might be enough to steady the ship before anyone looked too closely at the books. That is the truth about Julian Calloway, and it matters, because it would be easy to make him a simple villain and he wasn't quite that. He was a frightened man who had spent his whole life in the shadow of a father everyone respected, and he'd never once been sure he deserved the name on the door. Fear like that doesn't announce itself. It just quietly starts making decisions for you until one day you look up and you're standing in a ballroom calling your wife broken in front of 300 people because it's easier than admitting what you actually broke. Celine understood exactly what kind of man she'd found. She had built a career out of finding cornered men and making herself indispensable to them, and Julian Calloway, terrified and grieving his father and drowning in numbers he couldn't explain, was the easiest mark she'd had in years. 6 weeks before the gala, she told him she was pregnant. It was, conveniently, the exact leverage he needed. A pregnant mistress gave him grounds to move fast, to frame the divorce as destiny rather than betrayal, to hand Vivian the bloodline victory she'd been engineering for nearly a decade. Nobody in that family thought to ask for proof. Nobody thought they needed to. The story was simply too useful not to believe. She was careful about how she delivered it. She didn't tell him over dinner or in bed, where a man might have time to think clearly. She told him in his office at 11 at night, 3 days after an auditor had left a voicemail he hadn't returned, standing behind his chair with her hands on his shoulders, her voice pitched low and certain. This changes everything, Julian. Your mother will finally have a reason to back you fully. The board will see a man moving forward instead of a man explaining the past. Nobody looks backward at a man who's about to be a father. He had believed her, partly because he wanted to, and partly because Celine had learned, over 3 years of watching him from the periphery of the company, exactly which fears to press and exactly when to press them. The weeks leading up to the gala were the coldest of Naomi's marriage. Julian stopped coming home for dinner. Vivian stopped inviting her to family planning meetings for events Naomi had helped organize for years. Her name quietly disappeared from the guest list for the springboard retreat, an oversight, they said, so sorry. She found out from a board assistant, not from her husband, that Julian had scheduled a public statement at the Meridian Gala, an event she'd been told was simply the annual donor dinner. She should have known then. Instead, she put on the pale blue dress she'd worn to their 5th anniversary, because some stubborn, hopeful part of her still believed that whatever was coming, they would face it as partners. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. She stood in that ballroom and heard her husband dismantle 9 years of marriage into a single sentence about what her body couldn't do, and she watched Celine's hand drift to her stomach on cue, and something in Naomi went very still and very quiet, the same quiet her grandmother had taught her, the kind the world mistakes for nothing at all. She did not argue. She did not cry where they could see it. She set down her glass without a sound, and she walked out of that ballroom with her spine straight and her face composed, and it was only once she reached the parking garage, alone, that her hands finally started to shake. She did not go home that night. She checked into a small hotel 3 blocks away under her maiden name and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the lights, and it was there, in the dark, that her fingers found the thin gold bracelet on her wrist, the one Odalise had given her the week before she died. 4 years into the marriage. Naomi had worn it every day since and never once thought to look closely at the small hinged locket built into its clasp, so fine you'd need to be looking for it to find it at all. She had always assumed it was purely decorative. That night, numb and hollowed out with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, she finally pried it open. Inside, folded into a square smaller than a postage stamp, was a strip of paper in her grandmother's handwriting, so faded she had to angle it toward the window to read it. It was not a photograph. It was not a keepsake. It was an account number, a bank name in the city, and 6 words in Odalise's careful cursive. Elias knew. Ask for the letter. Naomi sat with that scrap of paper for a long time, turning over a memory she hadn't touched in years, a conversation with Elias on the terrace where he told her that families like his had a habit of forgetting who actually built what they had, and that he intended to make sure someone remembered. She had thought he was only being kind to a nervous young wife. She understood now, 4 years too late to thank him for it, that Elias Calloway had been protecting her the entire time, quietly, carefully, the way he did everything. She did not sleep that night. In the morning she called the number on Elias's old private line, the one that now belonged to Marguerite Voss, the family's longtime attorney, a woman careful and unhurried enough to have outlasted 3 generations of Calloway drama without ever once picking a side out loud. Naomi asked her one question. Is there a letter with my name on it? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Naomi thought the call had dropped, and then Marguerite said 4 words that changed the shape of everything. Come in this afternoon. What Naomi didn't yet know, what she wouldn't learn until she sat down across from Marguerite's desk that afternoon, was that the letter waiting for her wasn't really about money at all, not directly. It was about a clause Elias had quietly built into the family trust nearly 5 years earlier, buried in language dense enough that even Julian, who'd read the trust a dozen times looking for leverage, had never once understood what it actually protected. She never made it to that meeting the way she planned. Walking out of the hotel that morning, exhausted and lightheaded in a way she told herself was simple stress, Naomi collapsed in the lobby. She came to in an ambulance, an oxygen mask fogging with each unsteady breath, a paramedic's voice asking questions she couldn't quite focus on, and one thought looping through the fog before the world went dark again. Not now. Not before I know. She woke in a hospital room to soft fluorescent light and the quiet beeping of a monitor, and a doctor she'd never met, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Priya Osei, sitting at the foot of the bed with a chart in her hands and an expression Naomi couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to ask you something before I tell you anything else. Has anyone explained to you why previous pregnancy tests may have come back inconclusive?" Naomi shook her head slowly, bracing for one more piece of bad news to add to the pile. Dr. Osei set the chart down and looked at her directly. "You have a condition called a retroverted uterus with a secondary hormonal marker that suppresses early detection in standard tests, something that should have been caught years ago and wasn't. It's manageable. It's also, as of this morning's blood work, currently very relevant, because you are approximately 7 weeks pregnant, and from what I can see on this scan, the pregnancy looks strong." Naomi did not cry the way people cry in movies. She went completely silent, one hand pressed flat over her own stomach, staring at a small flickering shape on a monitor screen that the doctor turned toward her, a heartbeat too fast and too small and somehow the loudest sound she had ever not heard. Dr. Osei asked gently if she wanted a moment alone, and Naomi shook her head, because the strange truth was she didn't want to be alone with it, not yet, not until she understood what it meant beyond the obvious. She asked the doctor to walk her through the dates again, slowly, the conception window, the timeline, the exact week it must have happened, and somewhere in the recitation of numbers she realized it placed the pregnancy squarely inside a stretch of nights months before Celine had ever walked into Julian's office with a consultant's badge and a plan. 6 years. 2 losses. A husband who had stood in front of 300 people and called her the reason his family's bloodline would end with him. And the entire time, without either of them knowing it, she had been carrying the only thing that could undo every lie he'd told. She left the hospital 2 days later with a folder of medical records tucked against her chest like armor, and she went straight to Marguerite Voss's office, because the letter was still waiting, and she had a feeling, sitting in that waiting room, that the two secrets in her hands were about to collide in a way nobody in the Calloway family was prepared for. Marguerite slid a single sealed envelope across the desk, Elias's handwriting on the front, Naomi's name spelled the old-fashioned way he'd always insisted on using. Inside was a letter dated the year Naomi and Julian married, and a copy of an amendment to the Calloway family trust that Elias had filed privately, without his son's knowledge, the year he began to suspect the shape his empire would take once he was no longer alive to steer it. The letter began simply. "If you are reading this, something has gone the way I feared it might." Elias wrote that he had watched his own wife be diminished by his family for decades and had promised himself he would not let it happen twice under his roof if he could help it. The trust amendment was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequence. It stated that the Calloway controlling shares and the succession of the company presidency could pass only to a direct biological descendant of Elias Calloway born to a spouse legally married to a Calloway heir at the time of conception, verified by an attending physician and filed with the estate within 1 year of birth. Any attempt to install an heir born outside a recognized marriage, or any attempt to dissolve a marriage in order to circumvent this clause, would trigger an automatic freeze of controlling shares into a blind trust for 25 years, locking every Calloway, including Julian, out of the company his grandfather had built. Elias had written one final line at the bottom, underlined twice. "I built a door only one kind of honesty can open. I trust you to know when to use the key." Naomi sat in that office and understood, all at once, exactly what she was holding. Celine's baby, whoever's it actually was, conceived outside a marriage, filed under a mistress's name, would trigger the freeze the moment anyone tried to install it as heir. And her own child, conceived while she was still, on every legal document that mattered, Julian's lawful wife, was the only person on earth who could inherit the Calloway legacy cleanly. Julian had spent 6 weeks building an entire plan to disinherit her, and he had done it standing directly on top of the one thing that made his plan impossible. Julian found her that evening at the house, sorting through papers at the kitchen table with a stillness that unsettled him more than tears would have. He tried the voice he always used when he needed something, soft, reasonable, the voice of a man who still believed charm could undo consequence. "Naomi, baby, let's not do this the hard way. Sign the separation papers, take the settlement, and we can all move forward. You deserve to be free of all this anyway." She looked up at him for a long moment before she spoke. "I trusted you for 9 years, Julian. I'm done signing things I haven't read, and I'm done believing things I haven't checked." Something in his face shifted, the charm sliding off it like a coat off a hook. "You don't understand what's coming," he said, his voice cracking louder than the quiet kitchen called for. "I need this settled before the board meeting." "Then sit down and tell me exactly why," she said. He couldn't. He gathered his jacket and left without another word, and for the first time in their marriage, he looked less like a man in control of the room and more like a man being chased by something just behind him. The board meeting he'd been racing toward became the very room where everything came apart. It was moved, at Vivian's insistence, into a formal shareholder session 2 weeks later, meant to ratify Julian's new engagement to Celine and formally begin the process of restructuring succession around their expected child. Vivian wanted witnesses. She wanted it official, done, finished, so that by the time anyone thought to object, there'd be nothing left to undo. The room filled exactly the way she wanted it to. Vivian sat in the seat closest to the head of the table, spine straight, hands folded. Julian's 2 cousins from the board sat along the far wall, careful, watching. Celine arrived in sharp emerald silk, a hand resting protectively over a stomach that, notably, no one in that room had ever actually seen a doctor confirm. Marguerite Voss sat at the far end with a leather folder in front of her and the particular patience of a woman who has learned that the loudest person in a room is usually the one about to lose the most. Julian stood before anyone could stop him, buttoning his jacket to give his hands something to do, talking a little too fast. "Before we get into the formal business, I want to say something to this family. My father believed in strength, in moving forward, and it's time we stopped holding on to arrangements that no longer serve this company's future." He didn't look at Naomi once. "Effective today, I'm asking the board to recognize my intent to remarry and to begin succession planning around my child with Celine, the true continuation of what my father built." Vivian's mouth curved into the first real smile she'd worn in months. Celine reached for Julian's hand, not for comfort, for the room to see. One of the cousins along the wall glanced toward the empty chair that had been left, almost ceremonially, at Naomi's old place at the table, and looked away again quickly, uncomfortable with whatever question was forming in his own head. Then the door opened, and Naomi walked in. She was not the numb, hollowed-out woman from the hotel room 11 days earlier. She stood straight, hair pinned back, wearing no jewelry but the thin gold bracelet at her wrist, and she crossed the room with a slowness that made every conversation die mid-sentence. She set a single folder on the table in front of Marguerite and stepped back, hands clasped, and said nothing at all. Julian's composure flickered. "Naomi, this isn't the time." There was a thin edge under it now, the sound of a man hearing a floorboard creak in a house he thought was empty. "Let counsel finish her work," Naomi said. 6 words, level, and that was all. Marguerite opened the folder Naomi had handed her, glanced at its contents, and set aside the papers she'd been about to read instead. "Mr. Calloway," she said, mild as morning, "before you ask this board to ratify anything, I think you need to hear exactly where you're standing." "Excuse me?" "I'll say it plainly. Your father amended the family trust 5 years ago, privately, in a filing your legal team apparently never located because they weren't looking for it. Under that amendment, controlling succession can only pass to a biological Calloway child conceived while its parent was legally married to a Calloway heir, medically verified. Any attempt to install a successor born outside that condition triggers an automatic 25-year freeze on all controlling shares. Every Calloway, including you, locked out." The room had gone very still now, not the polite hush of a formal meeting, the other kind, the kind right before the ground gives. "Whose condition does that leave standing?" Vivian said, though some part of her had clearly already started doing the math and did not like the answer. Marguerite turned to the second document in the folder, medical records dated 11 days earlier, a physician's letterhead. A due date calculated backward with clinical precision to a conception date that fell 3 weeks before Julian first brought Celine into his father's old office as a consultant, and 8 months before the gala where he stood in front of 300 people and called his wife the reason this family's bloodline would end. Naomi Calloway is currently 9 weeks pregnant, conceived while lawfully and exclusively married to Julian Calloway. Under your father's own amendment, this is, as of this morning, the only pregnancy in this family that legally qualifies to inherit anything at all. Celine's hand fell away from her stomach. Nobody laughed now. Naomi lifted the folder Marguerite had set down and turned it so the room could see the sonogram clipped inside, small and grainy and undeniable. My grandmother left me the account number for a letter I didn't know existed. She left it in a bracelet I've worn every day for 4 years and never once thought to open. Elias gave it to her because he saw exactly what this family would try to do the moment he wasn't here to stop it. She let that settle. So you can announce whatever succession you like, Julian. You can stand up here and hand this whole company to whoever you please. But under your own father's rules, not one share moves anywhere without a child that legally qualifies, and right now, there's only one. Vivian found the edge of her chair and half rose out of it, her voice climbing thin and fast. That amendment is a fabrication. Elias would have told me. He told me everything. There is no fabrication, ma'am, Marguerite said, not raising her voice, because she never needed to. I filed it myself, at his direction, the week after his cardiologist gave him 6 months he ultimately outlived by 2 years. He knew exactly what he was protecting, and he knew exactly who from. Vivian's mouth closed. She lowered herself back into her chair like the seat had moved farther away than she remembered. Julian tried one last time, reaching for something that had already slipped past him. We can fix this. He said it to Naomi directly now, all the practiced softness gone, cracked clean through. Whatever you want, name it. The word came out of him like it cost something. I wanted you to be a better man than your fear, Naomi said, and her voice never rose either. That's the one thing in this room I can't hand you. Celine was already gathering her bag, chin lifted, reading the exits the way a person does when the room has stopped being useful to them. Don't any of you look at me like I'm the only one who lied in this building, she said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes as she said it. A woman with nothing takes the door that opens. I don't regret a single week of it. It was the closest thing to an honest sentence she'd offer anyone that day, and she was gone before the door finished swinging shut behind her, and quietly, though it would take the family's investigators another month to confirm it, gone along with any actual pregnancy at all, which it turned out had never existed outside the story she needed Julian to believe. Here is the part that keeps a story honest, because the clean, satisfying version would have Naomi walking out of that room glowing with vindication and nothing else. That isn't what happened. Marguerite passed her a second envelope before she left the building that day, Elias's private notes, years of them, quiet provisions made to protect a woman his own family had underestimated from the day she arrived. Reading them in the car afterward, Naomi understood something that cut through her victory clean. The one person in that entire family who had truly seen her, who trusted her before she'd given anyone reason to, was a man she'd never gotten the chance to properly thank, because he was 2 years in the ground and would never meet the grandchild his foresight had just protected. She had thought, for years, that he only tolerated her out of politeness. He had loved her like a daughter, quietly, the same way she'd learned to love, and she would carry that particular grief for a long time, folded in right next to the win. What happened to the Calloway family in the months that followed was real, and real is never as clean as the room wanted it to be. Julian did not go to prison. There was no dramatic scene, no handcuffs, no headline arrest. The freeze the amendment triggered on any illegitimate succession attempt exposed, in the process of legal review, exactly how much of the trust he'd already quietly drained to cover his own investment losses, and the board he'd spent 6 weeks maneuvering to control instead voted, almost unanimously, to remove him from any operational role pending a full audit. He kept his name. He kept a modest personal account untouched by the trust. He did not keep the company, the house, or the version of himself he'd been performing for a decade. The audit that followed took the better part of a year, and it surfaced a paper trail even Marguerite hadn't fully anticipated: transfers routed through 3 shell entities Julien had set up with the help of a financial advisor who was later barred from the industry entirely. None of it was framed publicly as a scandal, because the board, protective of the Callaway name even as they dismantled Julien's role within it, quietly negotiated a settlement that kept the worst of it out of the papers. It was, in its own way, one final inheritance he received without earning it, a family's instinct to protect its own reputation even while cutting him loose from everything else. Vivian moved into a smaller property on the same street she'd always lived on and told anyone who'd listen a version of events in which she was the one who'd been wronged all along. She never once apologized, not to Naomi, not to Julien, not to herself, and she got to keep her pride the way people sometimes do when they're too certain to bend, and that too was simply true to life. Julien found Naomi once more before it was over, on the front steps of the house neither of them lived in anymore, boxes already loaded into a car his mother sat waiting in. He said the cruelest true thing he could find, the way people sometimes do when there's nothing left to lose by saying it. "I never loved the idea of you having nothing to offer this family," he said. "I loved what marrying you cost me nothing to keep quiet, and I hated what it turned into. You'll have the company. You'll have the money. And you'll still know I only ever looked at you the way my father wanted me to." It landed exactly the way he intended it to. Naomi stood on those steps a long time after his car pulled away, one hand resting on the small, still flat curve of her stomach, and she did not cry where anyone could see it, because she'd never given him that, and she wasn't going to start now. But it cut. Winning the company didn't erase 9 years of wondering if she'd ever been loved for herself at all, and pretending it hadn't would have been its own kind of lie. She sat with that particular grief for months, and instead of running from what he'd said, she did the harder thing. She let it be partly true, and she let herself grieve the marriage she'd thought she had, even while building the one life that mattered more, and slowly, the sting of his words stopped being the loudest thing in the room. She could have taken the company and sold it, cashed out a fortune large enough to disappear into for several lifetimes, and never think about the Callaway name again. She turned down every offer that came in from competing hospitality groups circling the wreckage of Julien's mismanagement, because some things aren't worth what people are willing to pay for them. Instead, she rebuilt slowly, quietly, the way her grandmother had taught her to do everything, hiring back staff Julien had cut to cover his losses, reopening properties Vivian had let go to seed out of sheer disinterest, restoring the small original roadside motel Elias had started with decades earlier and turning it into a modest, living museum of the company's actual history instead of the polished myth the family had been selling for years. She kept Odalise's sewing table, moved all the way from Millhaven, in the lobby of that first motel, and told anyone who asked that it belonged there more than any of the crystal chandeliers the family had installed in later years, because it was the only piece of furniture in the entire company that had never once pretended to be something it wasn't. Staff who'd worked there for decades, people Julien had never bothered to learn the names of, started calling her simply Mrs. C, the way they once had Elias, and it took her a long time to understand that the name was a kind of trust she hadn't asked for and would spend years trying to earn properly. There were harder days folded into that rebuilding than the highlight reel of it suggests. There were nights she sat alone in Elias's old office, now hers, staring at spreadsheets she'd taught herself to read because she refused to hand that particular power to anyone else ever again, and wondered whether she was building something lasting or simply proving a point to people who would never fully admit they'd been wrong about her. Marguerite, who became something close to a friend in those years, told her once that the difference between revenge and restoration is that revenge needs an audience and restoration doesn't need anyone to be watching at all. Naomi held on to that on the days the work felt less like victory and more like simply the next right thing to do. Her daughter was born the following spring, 7 pounds, healthy, loud in exactly the way Naomi had once been told, wrongly, she'd never get the chance to hear. She named her Odalise, after the woman who'd handed her a bracelet with a secret folded inside it and never once explained why, trusting Naomi to find it when she was finally ready. Elias's old provisions, filed properly now under Naomi's guardianship, secured the girl's future the way he'd quietly intended all along, a door built years before anyone knew it would need opening, unlocked in the end by nothing more dramatic than one woman refusing to sign what she hadn't read. There is no scene where Vivian weeps and asks forgiveness. She simply lived out her years exactly as certain of her own righteousness as she'd always been, and that, too, is honest. Celine's fraud caught up with her eventually in a different city, with a different frightened man, the way these things tend to, and her name became a quiet cautionary story passed between people who'd once trusted her. She had built an entire career on reading desperate men correctly, and it had worked for her for the better part of a decade, right up until the one time it required a paper trail she couldn't manufacture fast enough. There was no dramatic downfall for her either, no headline, just a slow narrowing of rooms willing to have her in them, until the rooms ran out. Julian rebuilt something smaller, further from the family name, and to his credit, in the years that followed, he showed up, awkwardly and inconsistently at first, then more reliably, for the daughter whose existence had once been the very thing he tried to write out of the family story. Naomi never made that easy for him, and she never made it impossible either. She had learned the hard way that the difference between dignity and cruelty is knowing which doors to leave open a crack, even for people who once tried to lock you out entirely. On a warm evening a few years later, on the porch of the restored motel property that had become, against every expectation, the true heart of the company again, Naomi sat with her daughter curled against her side and finally, for the first time, told her the whole story, the ballroom, the bracelet, the letter, the key her great-grandfather had built into a piece of paper most people would have thrown away without a second look. She unclasped the thin gold bracelet from her own wrist and fastened it gently around her daughter's, small enough still to need an extra loop of the chain. "This won't make sense to you for a long time," she said. "But it holds something nobody can ever talk you out of, if you know where to look." Her daughter turned the tiny locket over in her fingers, not understanding yet, and that was fine. Understanding comes when it's time. Naomi watched her walk the length of the porch railing, bracelet catching the last of the evening light, and thought about a ballroom full of people who had once decided, in the space of a single sentence, exactly what she was worth to them. None of them had bothered to ask what she was carrying. That, in the end, had been their mistake to make, not hers. If any part of Naomi's silence in that ballroom ever felt like a moment you've lived yourself, the times you held your composure while someone tried to write your worth out of the story, tell me in the comments that she was carrying more than they knew. Like this video, share it with someone who's ever been underestimated in a room they had every right to stand in, and subscribe, because next week, another story like this one is waiting, and you won't want to miss how it ends.